Jack dedicated their time to that. And so, we worked together over the course of 2002 to put a set of policies and procedures together. So, cut my early teeth in prevention, working in a large organization in crisis that had ignored these kinds of, safeguards over decades and was now paying the price for it. It's a very large diocese. Boston is the fourth largest in the country. There are 4.5 million Catholics then, 364 parishes, 200 schools. And so we put together programs of policy, screening and hiring practices, education and training for all the adults and children in the schools and people in the parishes, and outreach to victims. So the mechanics of all that, putting that into place and watching it and oversight required the development of a new office called the Office of Child Advocacy. And I was named as its first director. And I was there at the diocese for 9 years, working those programs with parishes and schools and the hospitals, social service agencies, that sort of thing. After that period of time, I decided, when the programs were pretty much in place and on track, I decided to go into private practice. And I immediately started getting business from other faith organizations, the Jewish faith, the Quaker faith, Presbyterians, Congregationalists. I mean, they're pretty much calling, because no one's immune to this kind of issue. Although the Archdiocese of Boston was, of course, the poster child for this, it spread very quickly across the country to other dioceses, other faiths, internationally, across the pond and all that. So, I was inundated with work from other countries as well. UK, Ireland, South America, the Philippines. And so that work continues. But after a few years of that, I was contacted by Susan Bartley again at the Children's Trust and brought on board as a senior consultant to help with their programs. After around 2014, the state implemented a requirement for a task force for the prevention of child sexual abuse, and named about 30 organizations that needed to be in that task force, all state agencies, public and private, as well. We were charged with the task of building a set of guidelines and tools for the prevention of child sexual abuse in youth serving organizations in Massachusetts. And the challenge was that it was to cover any size youth serving organization, from the corner mom and pop shop, dance studio, karate studio, all the way up to the state's education programs. And so that was a challenge, but we managed to do it. And the report that came out of that detailed how organizations can go about this by developing a baseline set of minimum required standards for safety in youth serving organizations, and then identifying a risk structure, risk management structure, risk assessment structure, where they would determine if they needed more than just the basics based on their size, ages of the kids, the responsibilities, the likelihood of people being in unsupervised situations with kids and that sort of thing. And it went from there. The document was about 300 pages. It's pretty hefty. And it's on the Children's Trust website. But that was followed immediately in 2017 and 2018 by a series of community forums, where we went out into the community, east to west, north to south, and a series of 9 community forums where we invited people to come in representing youth serving organizations in those areas. Also invited politicians, local folks, local leadership, and we took them through the material, asked them what they were doing, asked them what they needed from us, from the task force. And the number one request was, you've got to make this more accessible. No one's going to sit down and read a 300-page document. And so accessibility, of course, required the development of a website. And so we worked for the next 2 years to develop a website to get this online, make it searchable, make it interactive, and get it out there into the community. And at safekidsthrive.org, I would encourage everybody to take a look at it. And so, I think there's been a tremendous evolution over the past 50 years in terms of awareness of child abuse and neglect. That the basic elements of protection involve policies and procedures, codes of conduct, recognizing and responding to child sexual abuse and reporting it, building safe physical and virtual environments, screening and hiring practices, training, and efforts at sustainability. So I think that's a little bit of history.
Yeah, no, you are just, I feel like it's really a pioneering adventure that you have been on to tackle this issue at its worst and really, bring us into the 21st century. And I feel like so much progress has been made in the past 40 years, way more than in all of humanity. So it's really an honor to have you here today and be able to share your contribution to this. And I'd also like to take a moment to have Delbar hop on and introduce herself, because she is actually part of the Children's Trust as well and works with the Safe Kids Thrive. So Delbar, if you'd like to introduce yourself now that you're here.
Hi everyone. Sorry I joined late. It's been 3 years and I'm still not used to Zoom. My name is Delbar Mehmedzadeh, and I'm the Parent Content and Prevention Specialist at the Children's Trust. I work alongside Tony and the rest of our team on the Safe Kids Thrive website.
Awesome. Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of what the Children's Trust does is really on the back end of supporting youth serving organizations. And what I'm hoping to do today is give parents and caregivers some guidance and some support about what they should expect from the youth serving organizations, so that we can kind of pull it from them so that they can also embrace these safety standards. So I know we're in Massachusetts, the Children's Trust is in Massachusetts, so some of this might be state specific, but what are youth serving organizations mandated to do by law to address child sexual abuse prevention? And would you say, it's sufficient, or what are your thoughts on that by law right now?
Well, by law, there's really no universal mandate for youth serving organizations to have these things in place. The only real oversight in Massachusetts and in many other states is in terms of those organizations that are licensed, accredited, certified, or otherwise under contract with or are financed by state agencies like Department of Education, Health and Human Services, Department of Public Health, Department of Mental Health, to provide unsupervised services to children or to other vulnerable populations. So those agencies are required to conduct criminal and sexual offense history, background checks on the people that they bring in. But there really are no associated mandates for maintaining a comprehensive abuse prevention framework, policies and procedures or codes of conduct or all that sort of thing, or training requirements, except for mandated reporters who are required to take a training course on an annual basis. So it's not sufficient. It's obviously not sufficient because it's not universal. It's largely unfunded. The unfunded mandates are usually not monitored well. There are large swaths of youth serving organizations that are not covered under these mandates. There are probably more youth serving organizations not covered by these mandates than are covered. So I think, there's, again, a large population of youth serving organizations who haven't a clue about this kind of stuff or have any requirement. Another problem is that, at least in this state, but in many states, every adult person is a mandated reporter. It varies from state to state. And those states that require everyone to be a mandated reporter if they see something to contact Children's Protective Services are in the minority. In Massachusetts, it's those people that I just described that are employed by those organizations. So, the list of mandated reporters in Massachusetts covers some obvious people like doctors and hospital personnel EMTs, dentists, nurses, law enforcement, the schools, obviously, early education, preschool, childcare, social workers, firefighters, police, that sort of thing. But it's not everyone. So they're not, and the other population of people in Massachusetts that are not covered by mandated reporting laws are volunteers. And at least my experience in schools and in the parishes and whatnot is that there's more volunteers there than there are employees. And so, who's talking to them about this stuff? This is not to say that youth serving organizations aren't interested in addressing these kinds of issues, only that there are a few mandates requiring them to do so. And, there are some insurance and risk management companies, for example, that require the organizations that they insure to have some sort of child abuse prevention framework. So I think it's starting. We encourage in our work the knowledge that anyone can make a report to the Department of Children and Families if they suspect that abuse is going on, and that every organization should have something, even if these people are not legally required to do so. There should be organizational policies that say to them, we require everybody and anybody who sees anything that might be causing harm to a child or observes harmful behavior toward a child to come forward. And if you don't, report it to DCF, which you can do as a non-mandated reporter, we will designate a person in the organization to receive those kinds of reports, look into it, and make the contact with DCF if you prefer. So, there are ways to get it done. And we encourage on our website and all of our publications, folks to do that. And we also include it in all our training.
And if I may, I want to add one thing there too. I think what I've heard from parents, and I just shared a story yesterday. This former teacher just received a life sentence for sexually abusing children in a school that he was teaching, like for the armed forces in Germany. And there were so many grooming behaviors going on that it wasn't necessarily harmful, but it was definitely concerning to adults. And I think that's where a lot of people struggle, is that this mentality of, well, technically it's not abusive, technically it's not against the law to give children massages or have them sit on your lap. And so how can youth serving organizations address things like that? What's the best guidance there?
Well, I think that when we put out any kind of information to youth serving organizations, especially schools, but any other youth serving organization, we need to make them aware of how child sexual abuse happens, and there are, and how to protect against it. So again, we talk about policies of screening and hiring and codes of conduct. Codes of conduct, I think, are the key to this issue that you're talking about. And we discuss how to put them together, what the basic elements are, what should be in them, that sort of thing. But essentially, what you're trying to do in an organization is to create an environment where there are guidelines, there are guardrails, there are definitions of acceptable behavior, non-acceptable behavior, dangerous behavior, and that those are incorporated into the documents, but not only into the documents, but in training, in professional development days, in supervision, that these things are talked about and basically made normative. My experiences with youth serving organizations where abuse has taken place is that people knew something was going on, but they didn't say anything. They didn't know how to say anything. They didn't know who to talk to, and didn't really even know the language to use in describing it. So people are reluctant, historically reluctant, to talk about child sexual abuse, not only among themselves, but also with their children. But we'll get to that a little bit later. But that's part of the problem. If you see something and don't talk about it, it persists. And if organizations don't put in place the means of building a culture, an organizational culture where these things are normal to talk about and why they're normal to talk about. And leadership doesn't take, the first steps and then remains involved in how this training takes place and talking about it on a regular basis so that it becomes normative, then it just continues and persists. So I don't know if did that answer your question fully or?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point about just the code of conduct is what
Oh,
is
yeah.
identifying appropriate behavior. So that way teachers or staff or whoever have an understanding. And I think also too, it's so important. And I feel like this might be a missing component to what is happening in youth serving organizations is that they're not educating the children on the code of conduct. So when things happen out of eyesight of other adults, the child doesn't know what's right and wrong. So I feel like that would also be helpful as well.
Yes. So educating adults, just to get to finish that point, if everyone sticks to a code of conduct that prescribes appropriate and inappropriate behavior, then behaviors that fall outside of those guidelines are more easily noticed. And that's where the grooming comes in that you mentioned. And grooming, that's another whole webinar, but basically there are signs that adults who have this desire to harm children show in organizations, in organizational settings. And it behooves every youth serving organization to train people as to what to look for and make it normal to bring that to someone's attention in leadership. Training children is another part of that. Now, don't get me wrong, we don't want to put the responsibility of preventing abuse on the hands of children. That is primarily the responsibility of adults and leadership in any organization. But children need to know. They're not being taught this stuff in the schools. In Massachusetts, there is no mandate to teach this in the schools. Now, there are programs that are being integrated. Certainly, Safe Kids Thrive has material for the schools, and we have links for materials and training and education and curricula for children that are evidence-based and that talk to kids about this kind of thing in a developmentally appropriate way, so that young kids, are taught, there are parts of your body that are private. And if anyone outside the family, outside your parents, who can touch those private parts to help keep you clean and healthy, tries to touch you there or asks you to touch them there, we want you to tell them to stop and get away and tell us or tell another trusted adult. And they define who the trusted adults are. As kids get older, you can say more developmentally appropriate things in terms of consent and sexual behavior of teens and all that kind of stuff. You can work that stuff in, but basically you want to be teaching children and integrating curricula into the schools where it's possible. And we've identified on our website, a number of evidence-based programs that work. We partnered with the Committee for Children in Seattle, for example, and a number of other agencies in the Archdiocese to come in and produce curricula for children for faith-based environments. And they have done that all over the country, also for public and private schools. That's their business. And that teaches children the basic rules and how to make disclosures and all that sort of thing. But primarily the job is parents and other caregivers to do this kind of thing. They need to take it seriously. It needs to be integrated more fully.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's definitely a team approach that has to be given, because sometimes people have the mentality, well, this is something kids shouldn't be taught at school because it's their parents' job to teach them. But in the same token, we have children that aren't being taught at home. There really isn't any major resource where their parents are getting this information. For the most part, they're seeking it out themselves. But in the same token, we want those messages reinforced by all the adults in the child's life. So they have this kind of, I consider it a culture of body safety where children continuously get this kind of messaging and know that it applies in every situation.
Exactly.
When we see these lawsuits, I mean, these are a lot of times these are multi-million-dollar, $100 million lawsuits with school systems, and of course, things like the Boy Scouts and what is the takeaway there when you see the effort that they either not only failed to protect kids, but they actually tried to hide it? I would feel like seeing that happen would encourage youth serving organizations and like you said, the insurance companies to say, hey, we need to do something about this because, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I'm curious why that isn't inspiring more organizations to take a more proactive approach.
You ask good questions. So, first of all, I think there's a natural tendency on the part of youth serving organizations that when abuse is discovered, they circle the wagons. And protect the organization or the business from scandal. We've seen that with faith-based organizations, the business world, other school districts all over the country. I mean, it's there. They want to protect themselves. We've also seen it with youth camps. You might remember the Camp Good News and the story that was Senator Scott Brown, who revealed a couple of years ago that he was abused at that camp. We've seen it with colleges and universities, with the Sandusky affair, the revelations. We've seen it with small and large youth-serving organizations. I mean, really, many organizations in the country, many youth-serving organizations, choose not to deal with this until something happens and it's made public. And by then it's too late. We've also discovered in our work that in many cases, allegations were brought to the attention of the youth serving organization, leadership over the years, and that were ignored, disbelieved, challenged, settled privately with non-disclosure agreements, and were not reported to the authorities. So with little consequence to the perpetrator, certainly no legal consequence. So there are institutional factors that send a message. If there's awareness that your institution will not hold you accountable for that kind of behavior with children, then it's going to continue. So another takeaway is that I think the cost of not putting these kinds of safeguarding policies in place vastly exceeds the cost of doing so. So if something happens and a child is harmed and it becomes public, that's really not a strong enough deterrent. I mean, the investment that it takes of time and in some case funds, but there are free programs available in terms of implementing responsible prevention strategies and practices before a child is harmed, really outweighs the lifelong consequences of the abuse that occurs to children in those kinds of environments. I think another key takeaway is that people in the organizations and youth serving organizations knew or had a feeling that something was going on, but didn't believe their own instincts, didn't talk about it with anyone, didn't know who to go to or how to report it, or just uncomfortable or embarrassed about it and stayed silent. So we have to become less reluctant to speak up and report. We also need to teach our kids, as we just talked about, in the schools and other youth serving organizations. But there's really no one size fits all solution to this. Another issue is that designing and implementing a safety protocol is hard. It needs to be flexible enough to accommodate youth serving organizations of different size, different responsibilities, different age children, and all that. And affecting behavioral change in an organization is a long-term process. It's not going to be immediate, but you have to begin somewhere, and most organizations don't know where to begin. That's why we've established a task force. That's why we put together Safe Kids Thrive website to give sort of a track for people to follow, to understand the issues and who to talk to about it. You got to have guidance and tools and strategies that can be implemented by different size organizations, and that's what we strive to provide. The final takeaway is that there are lots of barriers to discovery and disclosure, but we can work to set up barriers against silence and secrecy as well, so that when something's going on, it's not only noticed, but people are trained about how to talk about it, and these conversations become normative in youth serving organizations, and that they can do and say what needs to be done and said to keep the children safe, to get them out of those situations. And that, so, you know, I'm a firm believer that conversations in youth serving organizations, in schools, and YMCAs, or whatever, about adult behaviors toward children are a primary way to prevent this from occurring, because they talk about warning signs in adults. So before a child is harmed, it doesn't become an afterthought or a series of activities after a child is actually harmed, but can actually be predictive and can be utilized to look for those early signs of someone grooming a child, and act accordingly and appropriately in YSOs and communities.
Yeah, I think, you know, I mean, as we know, you know, a lot of sexual abuse occurs within the home. However, I think the most preventable child sexual abuse is in YSOs, because oftentimes there is this grooming process, and they have to gain access to children in order to sexually abuse them. So, you know, I think that's the great thing about doing this talk and having parents listen, is because they can also be advocates for these organizations. So I'm gonna jump ahead on one of my questions, because we're actually already more than halfway through our time. You know, what should parents be asking when they're vetting a school or a camp or an extracurricular activity? What kinds of questions should they be asking?
Well, you know, I think parents are certainly within their rights to ask questions of any youth serving organization that they entrust their children to. It's just a matter of fact, I think. The days of blind trust, dropping your kid off at the front door and then leaving for, you know, half a day or a full day, are long gone, or they should be long gone. But this is especially true in situations in YSOs where YSO staff will have unmonitored or unsupervised access to children. So, you know, program administrators, directors, you know, assistant directors, should be ready and more than happy to answer people's questions, to answer parents' questions about what's in place, you know, to protect my child from this kind of situation. Is the organization accredited, licensed, certified by a government or private agencies? For example, summer camps in Massachusetts can be accredited by the American Camp Association, which involves a voluntary review of over 300 elements of that organization for standards for health and safety. The American Camp Association of New England has a searchable database of 350 accredited camps and summer programs that have gone through this process, looked at their policies and procedures, and that they've accredited as, you know, safe environments to entrust children to. Does the youth serving organization conduct background checks? Is another question to ask on all staff and volunteers for criminal and sexual offense history. Are there published rules and guidelines about staff being alone with children? These are questions that every parent should ask before entrusting their child or children to any youth serving organization. What's the ratio of staff to children? And how does it change during events of higher risk, like overnight trips, water events, off-campus activities, that sort of stuff? Are there guidelines outlining acceptable conduct between staff and children? Is there a code of conduct covering staff behaviors? And also one governing behaviors between the kids themselves? These are questions any parents should ask of a youth serving organization that they're going to entrust their child or children to. Are staff and volunteers trained in child sexual abuse prevention, recognition, reporting responsibilities? Are the children always in a supervised situation? Are they ever out of sight of anyone in the organization? Where does my child go? Another question to ask. Where does my child go if they're uncomfortable with someone, or if someone's doing something to them, or another child is doing something to them in their environment, whatever it may be, a school, a camp, or anything like that? Where do they go to talk about these things? Are there written policies and procedures about the prevention of child sexual abuse? Will my child be able to communicate with me under any circumstances if they're uncomfortable? Sleeping arrangements, staff supervision, all kinds of questions can be asked of any youth serving organization that you're entrusting your child to. Hopefully these kind of questions, these sample questions, and you'll find a lot of them also on the Safe Kids Thrive website. So I'm putting a plug in there on that. These will help to start important conversations between the parents and the children and the organizations they're entrusting their children to. The Children's Trust, for example, has a fact sheet that I helped put together on, what parents should be asking, the questions parents should be asking of summer programming that they're going to be sending their kids to, for example, and other fact sheets like that. And there are indications that this is getting through to youth serving organizations, that they're taking this seriously. One example is that the director of the town of Winchester Recreation Department contacted us recently. They have a huge set of programs there for summer programs. They have some that are overseen by Health and Human Services, some that are overseen by the Department of Mental Health. These are camping programs. They have summer programs in water sports, tutoring programs. They just have a range of programming for the summer. The ones that are overseen by Health and Human Services or organizations like that, because they provide funding and oversight, require policies and procedures. And so, they had a set. Most of the other organizations that they're affiliated with don't. And so the question, the ask that came to us was, can you sort of evaluate the policies and procedures that we have to protect children in all of these programs? We'll send you our, like our top two, that cover most of the children. And if you can evaluate that, look at it, give us suggestions, give us advice. What are we missing? What are we doing well? That sort of stuff. And that takes effort and time to produce. But the youth serving organizations in Massachusetts are contacting us and asking those same questions. So I think we're getting through to it. And those are the kinds of questions too that parents should be asking of any youth serving organization that they're going to entrust their children to. What are your policies and procedures to protect my child when he or she is in your care?
And would you say that those policies and procedures should be freely available to parents to read on their own?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there should be no reason why they shouldn't have access to them.
Nope, absolutely none.
Yeah. Because I think that's a big part for parents, is that they'll ask and it's like, well, that's for our staff only. There's kind of this wall that they'll hit sometimes where they're not given access to that information. So it's good to know that they should be expecting that. And and then to twist it a little bit, some of these organizations aren't necessarily big enough, like you were saying before, to have a whole procedure and this and that. But I'll give you an example. My daughter took part in an art class at someone's house, and it was in the basement, and she had converted her basement into an art studio, but it was her house. So she had older children that were upstairs, a spouse most likely. And so how do you address, safety in more of these one-on-one settings, if it's a piano lesson, or a karate studio where there's only one teacher there. What advice would you give for parents in those kinds of situations? Because it's probably not going to necessarily, should it be a written out policy that they put together, or what would you recommend?
Well, I always recommend there should be written policies for any business that's dealing with children and youth. I mean, this has been a tough one. This has been difficult nut to crack, primarily because most of the small businesses that you're talking about are unregulated. They're private small businesses, and they're doing things their own way, and they're adverse to anything that smacks of oversight by a government agency. So I mean, we when we were doing our community forum series, between the time that our safety guidelines were published and the website came into fruition, we had this series of public events across the state, invited all youth serving organizations, local politicians, local law enforcement, parents, to come and talk to us about what they need in the community in terms of child safety and all that. We couldn't get many small businesses to come because, again, they're fiercely independent. We talked to town councils, chambers of commerce, civic leaders, local politicians, and I even looked up small businesses in the yellow pages and contacted them individually, told them what we were about and that we're coming to the community to get some feedback from them about child protection, activities. And none of them showed. Well, I say one of them showed up. It was a diaper service run by volunteers in the basement of a church. And they basically saying, well, we don't know anything about what you're talking about, but we're interested if somehow, because we're in touch with a lot of young parents. They come to us, asking for help. We provide laundry services and diaper services and all that kind of stuff. But we come in contact with a lot of them. And a lot of these kids are struggling with their newborns, and that's so if you've got something to offer us, we're glad to come, and they did. So that was an interesting thing, but most of them didn't. So we were really struggling with that, and then finally connected with a dance studio business that provided annual retreats to studios in the New England area. And they agreed to sponsor us at a special meeting. And so we picked a venue. One of the largest studios that was available was down South Shore. I think it was Norton. And he did the advertising, and the owner, and sent invitations out to his colleagues. And 13 dance studio owners showed up, some with staff. So, there's 25, 30 people in the room. And they came from Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New York. We learned a lot from that meeting about how you get to a small business and some of the concerns and fears that they have about government oversight. I mean, they're entrepreneurs. They're running their own business. They don't need oversight or rules and regulations or evaluations, that kind of thing. But we did learn a lot. We gave them a Child Abuse Prevention 101 kind of talk for the first part of the day. And then the second part of the day was talking about policies and procedures and what they have in place to address issues of child safety. The feedback was that the information was great. It made sense because they do a lot of touching of children, for example, in a dance studio environment, to position them, show them how to hold themselves, that sort of thing. So there is a lot of touching going on. But they wanted help in terms of crafting safe environment policies, child protection policies for their particular industry. And they ranged from a single owner storefront with a high school volunteer as an assistant and 25 to 30 students that meet a couple of times a week to a multi-location regional set of businesses that have half a dozen or more studios that they oversee and supervise. So it was a good meeting. We understand what they're looking for. And, you know, it's one of our ongoing conversations. You know, as far as single owner businesses, like you say, in someone's home, like a piano teacher or something like that, I think it would be helpful for them to learn about the aspects of prevention and child safety and what resources are out there. They could learn about safety standards for safe environments, and maintaining them as they pertain to a single owner business, where you're seeing kids alone with minor children. You're seeing you're running your business alone, like a piano studio, something like that, giving individual lessons. And you know, there are things that they can take away from the policies and procedures that we've already published. They can invite parents to sit in a room close by, for example, instead of making them wait in their car outside for the hour-long lesson. Leave the door open so that parents can observe. Invite parents into the lesson, as long as, you know, they don't interrupt, you know, that kind of thing. But, you know, like our conversations with the dance studio owners, they can be aware of the fact that children are vulnerable, that they should be asked before they're touched. And you know, that if you're trying to posture a child taking a piano lesson or something like that, I mean, have to show them correct hand movements, you know, arm positions, leg positions. And if you're touching them there, you need to ask their permission first and make sure they're okay with it. They can put together, you know, one-page rules and regulations and give it to parents, the safety rules that they abide by. And give it to the children and parents, and they can also attend online webinars. There are lots of online webinars out there to sensitize them to the safety aspects of a small business. Massachusetts Music Teachers Association, for example, has guidelines for teachers who are looking for local resources, professional development, guidance on running a performance event, because a lot of these folks take groups of children to performances, sometimes away, sometimes locally, inviting you know, parents to come along and that sort of thing for performance events in the community. You can provide certification certificates. Some of these organizations, like the Music Teachers Association, does provide certification or certification certificates, and they offer webinars that focus somewhat on child safety. Certainly not a comprehensive, you know, treatment of child abuse prevention, but child safety and some common sense rules and regulations. So, you know, technical assistance is available for small businesses. They just need to be aware of the fact that we're not bringing them to their attention to provide any kind of oversight or regulatory, you know, requirements on them, but we're trying to help them to create a safer environment that's respectful of the children and responsible to them and the parents. So it's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, we have a question here that actually kind of leads us into our last question of the afternoon is, as the head of children's ministry, what can I do to get the community on board to create a culture of body safety? And what are the best sources for training my volunteers? We have an old code of conduct. We do background checks, and we have online training that isn't great and is nearly impossible to get volunteers to do. So if someone is you know, watching now and they are part of a youth serving organization or volunteer with one, you know, what are some of the strategies they can, you know, use to kind of get buy-in and show people the value of doing this and why it's an important part of their work?
Well, I think obviously they you know, the way we began all of this work in the youth serving organizations that I was affiliated with is to sit down with parents and talk to them, and you know, talk to them about how they keep their children safe, the safeguards they put in place, and that sort of thing. There are programs. I mean, they can certainly look on our website, Safe Kids Thrive, and get a lot of guidance about how to put a set of policies and procedures together, what should be the basic elements of a set of policies and procedures, how they're going to conduct themselves in terms of oversight, accessibility to parents, accessibility to children, and go from there. I mean, there is a lot more information out there now in terms of how small businesses, for example, can and schools and whatnot can access structures, outlines, basic outlines that talk about how you put together a set of policies and procedures for child safety, that sort of thing. And we provide guidance, and we provide attachments and model documents and things like that, and model strategies about how to go about doing it in a community, and some of the pushback that you might get and how to deal with it, that sort of thing. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. And you know what, I think, and it's evolved too over time now, because I think parental involvement is even more necessary now that kids have smartphones with them. A lot of inappropriate stuff is happening in between children. So, they might need to revise their policies about how do you address children bringing phones into the dance class or on a school bus. I mean, plenty of inappropriate stuff is happening because kids are being exposed to pornography, and their brains just aren't developed to really understand the consequences of taking an inappropriate picture of someone or doing something. So I feel like it's even more important that these youth serving organizations are talking about this, because a lot of it's not necessarily sexual abuse, but it's inappropriate behaviors that are impacting the other children that are being served by that organization. So it's kind of coming out of the woodwork more and more. And as a parent myself, we've experienced it and heard stories from other parents and how this is impacting them when their kids go to school or whatnot. So I think it's just becoming even more vital that youth serving organizations really look into what steps can be taken, but also engaging more with parents and having these kinds of conversations, especially when we think about the fact that parents really are not getting a lot of exposure to abuse prevention education. So to have their youth serving organization host a talk or, do something like that just reinforces even more how important this is, and that we all kind of have to work together, especially we know how prevalent youth, perpetrated sexual abuse is, that the risk might not come from an adult or a volunteer. It might come from another child. So, mitigating that risk is also an essential part of it as well, I think.
Absolutely. I can't agree with you more on that, especially the latter part that you just mentioned about child-on-child situations. There's been some recent research. We used to think that, child-on-child situations maybe covered 30% or so of child abuse that occurs in the schools, for example. But that number is increasing. What the latest research puts the number 70% around there.
Mind-blowing.
It is mind-blowing. And so, schools, youth serving organizations, parents need to be mindful of this and how to talk to your kids about this stuff. So that, the courses are out there. And we connect to a lot of them, via the website that we posted. There are a lot of other resources out there, Stop It Now, Darkness to Light, National Center for the Sexual Behavior of Youth, hot chocolate talks from the Committee for Children out in Seattle. There's also training programs for parents that are appropriate coming out of the Children's Trust that, that Delbar is a part of as well. Basically, developing your comfort level in talking about this stuff with your kids, and developing skills that will allow that kind of conversation to take place in a non-threatening way so the kids don't clam up. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so there's training out there, there's help out there, and using organizations like the Children's Trust and whatnot that list those kinds of resources on their site and on the documents that we've produced, like the task force, are out there to use.
Yeah. When we did our research report last year on parental and caregiver perspectives on child sexual abuse prevention, we asked people who were survivors if they had been educated in body safety as a child. And it was really interesting because when you looked at the people who did not experience sexual abuse and the people who did experience sexual abuse, there was no increase or decrease in how much education they received. A child did not disclose any sooner if they had received body safety education. So it was really essential to have parents, and they might not be able to disclose to a parent. You know, when we have these school presentations and a child discloses, it's because they finally felt like this was something they could talk about and they knew who they could talk to. And furthermore, with that on schools, a lot of the conversations I've had with teachers over the years is that a lot of inappropriate stuff, not necessarily abusive, but I'm sure this is where abusive behaviors can happen, is in the bathrooms. And it's like every time I bring it up, it's kind of like the big secret, like, oh, I know, but it seems like they're just hesitant to talk about it. So we actually created a body safety etiquette poster for schools and youth serving organizations, because kids need reinforcement about what's appropriate constantly. You know, it's not just like, they can't just have a talk once a year at school. It needs to be reinforced at home. It needs to be reinforced where they are. So if they're at camp all summer, or if they're at school all year round, that's where they're spending the majority of their time. So it's like they need to have reinforcement where they are the most of the time. So thank you so much for all your time today. And Delbar, do you want to just do one final summary about the Keep Kids Safe Safe Kids Thrive website, about what kind of resources on there? Because I know there's people from other states. Would you say that these resources should be applicable to other people and help, you know, point them in the right direction?
Yes, absolutely. The 8 elements of prevention that Safe Kids Thrive outlines on how to prevent child sexual abuse is pertinent. Doesn't matter what state or what city you're in. They're all very highly adaptable by any sort of organization where there's an adult and child interaction. Also on the website, there's a 5-question assessment that anyone can take to kind of assess on what standard they're already implementing child sexual abuse prevention tactics. So whether you're work at a youth serving organization, or you're a parent or caregiver who wants to bring this to their child's youth serving organization and ask them to take this 5-question assessment to see where they are in the fight against child sexual abuse. And then I will drop the link to Safe Kids Thrive once again. But I would really just suggest to everyone to go in to read the 8 elements of prevention, and then kind of see what, you know, their youth serving organization is doing or not doing or can adapt, or you know, just kind of like where you are with the efforts of preventing child sexual abuse.
And a final point on that, and I agree with everything you said, is that we also have material for child abuse prevention in schools. And on the Children's Trust website is a document that we've kept updated, and it's about to go into its 4th edition. Steps towards child abuse prevention and creating safe school environments, which really focuses everything that we've been talking about to the school environment. So teachers out there and you know, instructors and whatnot can access that as well.
Yeah, well, thank you both so much for your time. One final note for anybody who was watching this, or we did stream live on Facebook, so it will be out there in perpetuity. But if you watch this and you feel an urge to say something to your youth serving organizations, don't hesitate to have that conversation, because you can absolutely instigate change for your entire community. If every community had one individual advocate that simply had these kinds of conversations with their schools and the youth serving organizations and shared resources like Safe Kids Thrive, there is just so much positive work that can be done. A little bit of moral courage goes a long way, and I don't want anyone to ever feel like they're too small to make a difference in this issue. That's what the Mama Bear Effect is about. It's about finding that inner Mama Bear inside you and being a voice for children, because their safety and their innocence is worth every bit of effort that we put into it. So I want to thank Tony so much for your time, Delbar for coming on and sharing all these great resources with everyone. I hope you guys got some really valuable information, and we'll put it into practice for your community. So thank you so much both. I'm gonna hit the stop button for